This is the Sony A7R V, the latest camera from Sony with 61 megapixels, animal tracking, and the latest in artificial intelligence to help your focusing system. Whereas this is the Sony FE100-400 f4.5 to 5.6, and this is my favorite lens by far. I pretty much take this wherever I go, whether it comes to wildlife, landscapes, delicious goodness. So with this paired with this, I'm going to be going through my opinion, my thoughts of these two together when it comes to wildlife photography, and also sharing a few tips when it comes to nailing focus. Firstly, the lens. Probably not the first lens you would reach for when it comes to wildlife photography. Most people would probably go for something like a 200 to 600, whereas this stops at just 400 millimeters. The reason I own this over the 200 to 600 is because it's lighter, it's smaller, it's just easier to carry, it's better on my back. I'm getting old. But I've done a whole video about this lens, so I'll leave a link up here if you want to watch that. Unfortunately, because it is only 400 millimeters, there are times when your subject is just that little bit out of reach. In these situations, you have two options other than obviously buying a longer lens. You have the option of buying a teleconverter if you wish, so you get a 1.4 times or a 2 times teleconverter. Hopefully gonna be doing a video about the 1.4 times in the next few weeks. Or the second option is to simply crop your image. And that's one of the reasons that the Sony A7R V is my current go-to camera. Having 61 megapixels on that sensor means you could take a photo and crop down to around about a quarter of that, giving you 15 megapixels, and still with them 15 megapixels, it's plenty big enough for you to post on the internet, post on social media, and even make a fairly nice sized print. And by cropping your image rather than using a teleconverter with this, it means that you're not going to lose at least a single stop alight with the 1.4 or 2 stops with the 2 times. I've owned this camera since the day it started shipping, and I've got to say, some of the photos I've taken with this camera are literally some of the photos I've always dreamt of taking, especially this one. And this is really weird. I don't know whether there's actually any truth behind this or whether it's just simply a placebo effect, but I actually feel like editing the raw images from this camera inside Photoshop to get rid of the distractions using the Content Aware Fill tool is actually giving me better results than any other results I've got from any other camera I've owned. As I say, I don't know if there's any science to it, but if I was to take a guess, because it's got so much information in each image, it just gives the software a little bit more to work with. The files from this camera are so large and literally just crammed full of data. Speaking of file sizes, all of the photos which you've seen in this video are shot in compressed RAW, not uncompressed or lossless. Why? Well, one is file size. A full uncompressed RAW file from this is around about 130 megabytes. But a compressed RAW file is half of that, but by doing that, you do go from 14-bit RAW color down to 12-bit RAW color. But me personally, I would never look at any of these photos and think, yeah, they're definitely 12-bit color, not 14. But I've done a full video where I go in depth into the raw compression. I'll leave a link up here if you want to watch that. But one of the main reasons I chose to shoot in compressed RAW when doing wildlife photography with this camera is because when you're wanting to do wildlife photography, you probably want to take a lot of photos in a small amount of time, high amount of bursts. You want to turn that drive mode to high plus most likely. Now, when you do that with this camera on the mechanical shutter, you can get 10 frames per second when shooting in compressed RAW. But unfortunately, when you shoot in uncompressed RAW or even the lossless, that frames per second drops to just over half of that. It's either 6 or 7 frames per second rather than the 10. It's not a major thing between the 10 frames per second and the 6 frames per second, but then 4 frames could be the matter of either getting the money shot or not getting the money shot. And ultimately, it comes down to what kind of subjects you're taking photos of. Speaking of nailing the money shot, when I started taking photos with both of these, I found that the focusing was just a little off. Then I realized that not only can you update the firmware for any of the Sony cameras, but you can also do it with any of the Sony lenses. Sure enough, I went onto the Sony camera website, had a look, and there's a new version of software. This was actually only on version 1, and I think it's now version 4. And in the latest version of firmware, when this was released, it says that it's to improve the stability of this lens working with this camera. Not 100% sure what that means, but as soon as I updated it, every single shot I've taken with these two are perfect. So if you've gone out and bought the new Sony A7RV, I'd recommend checking the firmware for pretty much all your lenses just to make sure you're up to date. So when it comes to nailing the shot, two of the most important things when it comes to wildlife photography is shutter speed and also your focusing mode. In terms of shutter speed, some of these photos were taken at 1/500, others at 1/1000, and maybe a fraction more. But that entirely depends on the lighting situation you have in front of you, so you may have to crank the ISO up a little bit and use a little bit of noise reduction in post. The second important thing when it comes to photographing wildlife is the focusing modes. This did take a little bit of time to go through all the settings on the A7RV to get to something which I find really good. Obviously this camera has subject recognition, which you should turn on if it isn't already on when you first get the camera. To do this, press the menu button and then go to the autofocus manual focus menu, page 3. Then go to page 3 within that section and make sure that subject recognition in autofocus is set to on. Below that you can choose your target option. Obviously with it being wildlife, you want to change that to either bird or animal, or you have a hybrid of both. I also turn off the autofocus with shutter, so I have to use the AF on button, so back button focusing. It's just personal preference, but that's the way I like to take my photos. I also turned up the autofocus tracking sensitivity to number 5, which is the most responsive, because I want the camera to be looking and adjusting for the subject moving around in frame. The final key ingredient that I found on this camera, which enables me to get really tack sharp photos, is the focus area. I found that if you go to the bottom of the focus area menu, you can have the tracking option. I set that either to center or wide, depending on what's happening in the frame. Sometimes I found that if my subject is well hidden inside things, the camera has struggled to detect that that is, let's say, a bird or an animal. So to help it out, I set the tracking to be center weighted, so therefore I have a little bit more control of what it's gonna focus on. But for the most part, when I'm taking photos of animals out there just roaming about or flying around the sky, setting it to tracking wide is the best option because it will track anything on the screen. I literally have no reason to up-talk this camera. Is that the right word? Up-talk? Upsell? Talk about his camera anymore to try and make you go out and get one. I'm literally just thoroughly blown away by how well this camera performs when it comes to photography. If you want to see any more content about the Sony A7RV or anything else on the channel, let me know down in the comment section below and I'll try and make it happen. If you enjoyed the video, then hit the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe. And if you do, I will see you right there. Thank you very much for watching and take care.